Hi, I'm Delilah. Last weekend at my cousin's engagement party, my family spent the entire evening mocking my pathetic fake wedding ring and laughing about my pretend marriage to a man they'd never bothered to meet. But when I walked into prestigious gems on Rosewood Avenue the next morning to get it cleaned, everything changed. The elderly jeweler took one look at my ring, his eyes went wide, and he whispered, "Mrs. Ashford? Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford?" The room went dead silent. My sister-in-law's champagne glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble floor, because standing behind me was my entire family who had followed me there to expose my lies, and they just learned that my husband owns half of Denver's skyline. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Grandview Country Club, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. I should have known it was going to be one of those days when I walked into my cousin Penelope's engagement brunch and immediately felt every eye in the room land on me like I was wearing a scarlet letter. The soft classical music playing in the background couldn't mask the sudden drop in conversation volume that happens when people are trying to whisper about you while pretending they're not. I smoothed down my simple navy dress, nothing fancy, just something comfortable from my local department store, and made my way toward the beautifully decorated tables draped in cream linens and adorned with cascading orchids. The entire Whitmore family was there in their finest attire, looking like they'd stepped out of a country club catalog. Designer handbags perched on chairbacks, jewelry that caught the light just right, and shoes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. My Aunt Cordelia spotted me first, her perfectly manicured eyebrows raising just slightly as she took in my appearance. She was seated at what was clearly the family table, surrounded by my cousins Penelope and Jasmine, along with Jasmine's husband Trevor. They all had that particular look on their faces, the one that said they were about to enjoy themselves at my expense. "Well, well," Cordelia announced, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence." Her voice carried that syrupy, sweet tone that Southern women perfect when they want to deliver an insult wrapped in fake politeness. "And wearing her little costume jewelry again, I see." I felt my cheeks warm as I took the empty seat they'd clearly left for me at the far end of the table, the spot where someone sits when they're included out of obligation rather than genuine desire for their company. My fingers automatically moved to touch my simple silver band on my left hand, a gesture that had become unconscious over the past 3 years of marriage. "Oh, Delilah," Penelope cooed, leaning forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know we've been dying to meet this mysterious husband of yours. What's his name again? Nathan? Nick?" She paused dramatically, tapping her perfectly glossed lips. "It's just so interesting how in 3 years of marriage, none of us have ever actually seen him." Trevor chimed in with a laugh that sounded like a bark. "Maybe he's too embarrassed to be seen with her." The comment earned him approving nods from around the table, and I felt my stomach twist into that familiar knot I'd carried since childhood, the one that formed whenever my family decided I was the day's entertainment. Jasmine examined her own engagement ring, an immense diamond that caught the morning light like a disco ball, and then pointedly looked at my simple band. "Honey, you know we're all worried about you, right? This whole fantasy marriage thing, it's getting concerning. I mean, look at that ring." She gestured dismissively with her French manicured finger. "I've seen better jewelry in a gumball machine." The conversation around nearby tables had completely stopped now. Other country club members were openly staring, some leaning closer to catch every word of what was clearly becoming the morning's entertainment. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment, but something else was building inside me too. A quiet anger that I'd been swallowing for too long. "It may not be much to look at," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt, "but it means everything to me." This sent the table into barely contained laughter. Cordelia actually had to dab at her eyes with her linen napkin.
Oh, sweetheart, we know you think it means something, but playing dress up with fake jewelry and pretending you're married to some imaginary Prince Charming isn't healthy. You're 32 years old, Delilah. It's time to face reality. The reality, Penelope added, is that you work part-time at a flower shop, live in that tiny apartment on the wrong side of town, and apparently spend your spare time creating elaborate fantasies about a husband who conveniently never shows up to family events. She gestured around the opulent room. This is what real success looks like, Delilah. Real marriages, real jewelry, real life.
I looked around the table at these people who shared my blood but had never once tried to know the real me. They saw my simple clothes, my modest job, my quiet nature, and they'd written my entire story without ever asking me to tell it myself. For 3 years, I'd endured their comments about my fake marriage and their speculation about my husband's absence from family gatherings. I'd bitten my tongue through countless holidays where they'd make jokes about my invisible husband and question whether I was having some sort of breakdown. What they didn't know, what I'd never told them because frankly it wasn't their business, was that my husband traveled constantly for work. International business deals, mergers, acquisitions, the kind of high-stakes negotiations that happened in boardrooms across different time zones. When he was home, we treasured our quiet time together, and the last thing either of us wanted was to subject our peaceful marriage to the circus that was every Whitmore family gathering. But as I sat there, feeling the weight of their judgment and the stares of strangers, I realized I was done protecting them from their own ignorance. I was done being their source of entertainment and their cautionary tale. I was done letting them believe their version of my story. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the marble floor in the sudden quiet. "You know what?" I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "You're absolutely right about one thing. It is time to face reality." I pulled my phone from my purse and opened my text messages, scrolling to my husband's contact. My fingers moved quickly across the screen. "Free for lunch today? The family would love to finally meet you." His response came back almost immediately. "Always free for you, darling." "Where and when?" I looked back up at the table of expectant faces, all waiting for me to crumble or apologize or slink away in embarrassment like I'd done so many times before. Instead, I smiled. Genuinely smiled for the first time all morning. "Actually," I said, slipping my phone back into my purse, "I think it's time you all learned exactly who I really am. And more importantly, who I married." The silence at the table stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then Cordelia let out another one of those patronizing laughs. "Oh, Delilah, please don't make this worse by—" "Tomorrow morning," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. 10 a.m. at prestigious Gems on Rosewood Avenue. I'm getting my ring cleaned, and you're all invited to come watch. Bring your questions about my fake marriage. Bring your doubts. Bring everything. I turned to leave, then paused and looked back one more time. "Oh, and Aunt Cordelia? You might want to wear something nice. You're about to meet my husband, and trust me, first impressions matter." As I walked toward the exit, I could hear the explosion of conversation behind me, voices overlapping in excitement and disbelief. They thought I was having some sort of breakdown, doubling down on my delusions in the most public way possible. They had no idea that tomorrow morning would be the last time they'd ever look at me with pity or condescension. They had no idea that everything they thought they knew about my life was about to shatter like Jasmine's champagne glass would the next day. Because tomorrow, they were going to learn that quiet little Delilah, the family disappointment, the one with the fake ring and the imaginary husband, was actually Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford. And Nathaniel Ashford owned half of Denver. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive home from the country club felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my modest Honda Civic as I replayed every cruel word, every dismissive laugh, every pitying look.
The Denver skyline stretched out before me through my windshield, glass towers reaching toward the cloudy afternoon sky, but I barely saw any of it. All I could think about was the way Trevor had actually snorted when I mentioned my husband's name, and Penelope had whispered something to Jasmine that made them both giggle like schoolgirls sharing a secret. My apartment building on Maple Street was a far cry from the Whitmore family's sprawling estates in Cherry Hills Village. The brick facade needed repainting, and the small lobby with its worn carpet and flickering fluorescent light felt especially shabby after spending the morning surrounded by crystal chandeliers and marble floors. But it was home, and more importantly, it was honest. Unlike my family, these walls didn't pretend to be something they weren't. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3B, my heels clicking against the old wooden steps. Mrs. Patterson from 3A poked her head out as I passed, her gray curls barely visible above the chain lock she kept permanently fastened. "How is the fancy party, dear?" she asked, her voice warm with genuine interest. Mrs. Patterson was 78 years old and had been my neighbor for 3 years. She'd never once questioned my marriage, never doubted my stories about Nathaniel's business travels, never made me feel like I needed to prove anything to her.
Oh, you know how family gatherings can be, I said, managing a weak smile. Full of surprises. She chuckled knowingly. Honey, I raised 4 children and have been married for 56 years. Family gatherings are either boring as church or dramatic as a soap opera. There's rarely an in-between. If only she knew, I thought as I unlocked my door. My apartment was small but cozy, with cream-colored walls and furniture I'd collected piece by piece from thrift stores and clearance sales. The living room faced west, and the afternoon sun streamed through the simple white curtains, casting everything in a golden glow. It wasn't much, but it was ours, mine and Nathaniel's, when he was home. I kicked off my heels and padded barefoot across the hardwood floors to the kitchen, where I immediately started making tea. It was a ritual I'd developed over the years whenever I felt overwhelmed. Earl Grey with honey, served in the delicate china cup Nathaniel had brought me from London during one of his business trips. The familiar routine helped calm my racing thoughts. As I waited for the water to boil, I found myself staring at my wedding ring again. It really was simple. A plain silver band with small diamonds arranged in a delicate pattern around the circumference. To anyone else, it might look unremarkable, even cheap. But I knew its story, knew the thought and love that had gone into choosing it, knew what it represented. 3 years ago, when Nathaniel proposed to me in the tiny botanical garden behind the flower shop where I worked, he'd been nervous in a way that seemed impossible for a man who negotiated million-dollar deals for a living. He'd gotten down on one knee right next to the rose bushes I'd been tending, and when he opened that small velvet box, I'd gasped, not at the size of the diamonds, but at how perfectly the ring seemed to capture everything I loved about our relationship. Understated, elegant, and quietly beautiful. "It's not the biggest ring in the world," he'd said, his dark eyes searching my face for approval, "but every stone was chosen specifically for you. The jeweler in Switzerland said the diamonds have perfect clarity. They're flawless, just like you are to me." I cried when he slipped it onto my finger, not because of its monetary value, but because he'd seen me clearly enough to know that I'd prefer something meaningful over something showy. That was Nathaniel, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Always considering not just what would impress people, but what would truly matter. The kettle's whistle pulled me back to the present. I poured the steaming water over my tea bag and carried the cup to my small dining table, where I could look out the window at the city beyond. Somewhere out there, in a glass office tower I could probably see from this very spot, my husband was likely in back-to-back meetings, managing the kind of business empire my family couldn't even imagine. Nathaniel Ashford hadn't started wealthy. That was something I'd learned gradually during our courtship. He'd grown up in a middle-class family in Portland, worked his way through college, and built his fortune through a combination of brilliant investments, strategic partnerships, and an work ethic that often kept him at the office until midnight. He'd bought his first property at 25, his first building at 30, and by the time I met him 2 years later, he owned enough real estate to make him one of Denver's most influential businessmen. But the man that I'd fallen in love with wasn't the billionaire real estate mogul the business magazines wrote about.
He was the guy who brought me coffee every morning when he was in town, who remembered that I preferred daisies to roses, who listened to me talk about my day at the flower shop like arranging bouquets was the most important job in the world. He was the man who proposed in a garden instead of a restaurant because he knew I'd be more comfortable there. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's wealth, the trust funds and inheritance money they were so proud of, came from old Denver society families who'd made their fortunes in mining and cattle ranching generations ago. They'd never built anything themselves, never risked everything on a dream, never worked 18-hour days to turn a vision into reality. They'd simply been born into money and spent their lives managing what previous generations had earned. Nathaniel, on the other hand, had created his empire from nothing. Every building that bore the Ashford name, every successful development project, every strategic acquisition, it had all come from his mind, his ambition, his refusal to accept limitations. And yet my family looked at me with pity because I worked at a flower shop and lived in a modest apartment. What they didn't understand was that I worked at Bloom and Blossom Florist by choice, not necessity. I loved the creativity of floral design, loved being surrounded by beauty every day, loved helping people celebrate their most important moments with the perfect arrangements. Nathaniel had offered countless times to help me start my own shop or expand the business, but I was happy where I was. I didn't need his money to feel valuable or successful. And I lived in this apartment because it was where we'd started our marriage, where we'd learned to be a team, where we'd built our most precious memories together. Sure, Nathaniel owned a penthouse downtown and a house in Aspen, but this little place on Maple Street was home. This was where he'd first said he loved me, where we'd planned our simple courthouse wedding, where we'd spent countless quiet evenings just being together. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart skipped when I saw Nathaniel's name on the screen. "How did the brunch go? Did you have fun with your family?" I found myself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time all day. Fun wasn't exactly the word I'd use to describe the morning's humiliation, but tomorrow's confrontation at the jewelry store? That was going to be the definition of fun. I typed back quickly. "Let's just say they're very excited to meet you tomorrow. Fair warning, they think you don't exist." His response came immediately. "Well, that should make our introduction interesting. Can't wait to prove them wrong." I could practically hear the amusement in his voice. Could picture the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth when he was particularly pleased about something. Nathaniel had a competitive streak that had served him well in business, and I had a feeling he was going to enjoy tomorrow's revelation almost as much as I was. Setting my phone aside, I walked to the small bookshelf in the corner where I kept our photo albums. I pulled out the leather-bound book from our wedding day and flipped through the pages slowly. There we were at the courthouse, both of us grinning like teenagers who'd just pulled off the perfect prank. There was the small reception we'd held afterwards at a private room in Nathaniel's favorite restaurant, attended by just a few close friends and Mrs. Patterson, who'd insisted on being there to witness young love triumph. Not a single member of my family had been invited. Not because I was trying to hide anything, but because I learned long ago that they had a way of turning even the most beautiful moments into competitions or opportunities to offer unsolicited criticism. Our wedding day had been perfect in its simplicity, and I wouldn't trade those memories for all the elaborate ceremonies in the world. I closed the album and looked around my little apartment with fresh eyes. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. My family would learn the truth about who I'd married, about the life I'd been quietly building while they assumed I was failing at everything. They'd realize that their dismissive comments and cruel jokes had been directed at someone who could buy and sell their trust funds without blinking. But more than that, they'd learn that I hadn't needed their approval or their money or their acceptance to build something beautiful. I found love, respect, and partnership with a man who saw my worth not in terms of dollar signs or social status, but in the simple fact that I made his complicated life feel like home. The afternoon sun was starting to fade, casting longer shadows across my living room floor. In less than 18 hours, I'd be standing at prestigious Gems on Rosewood Avenue, watching my family's faces as they realized that everything they thought they knew about my life had been spectacularly, wonderfully wrong. I couldn't wait. The next morning arrived with an unseasonable chill for late September in Denver. I stood at my kitchen window watching the city wake up through the thin layer of frost that had formed overnight on my fire escape. My coffee was getting cold in my hands, but I couldn't seem to focus on anything except the knot of anticipation building in my stomach. Today was the day. Everything would change. But as I got ready for what would become the most satisfying morning of my adult life, my mind drifted back to how we'd gotten here. The pattern of dismissal and mockery from my family hadn't started with my marriage. It had been building for decades, each incident more painful than the last, until I'd learned to expect nothing from them but disappointment. I was 8 years old when I first realized I didn't fit the Whitmore family mold. It was Christmas morning at Grandmother Whitmore's estate in Cherry Creek, and the entire extended family had gathered for the annual gift exchange. While my cousins Penelope and Jasmine were unwrapping designer dolls and expensive toys, I'd been thrilled to receive a beginner's art set. Watercolors, brushes, and a small pad of paper. I'd spent the entire day in the corner of the grand living room carefully painting little flowers and trees while the adults discussed business and society gossip. "Look what Delilah made," my mother had announced later that evening, holding up my painting of a sunflower. But instead of pride in her voice, there was that particular tone of amused condescension that I'd become too familiar with. "Isn't that precious?" Aunt Cordelia had glanced over from her conversation about the country club's new tennis courts. "Well, it's certainly colorful," she said with a laugh. "Maybe we have a little artist in the family, though I suppose someone has to be the creative type."
Even at 8, I'd understood that creative type wasn't meant as a compliment. It was their polite way of saying I was the one who didn't quite belong, the one who'd probably never amount to much in their world of business connections and social climbing. The pattern had continued through high school. While Penelope was homecoming queen and Jasmine was student body president, I'd spent my time in the art room or working part-time at a local greenhouse, learning about plants and flowers. My report cards were excellent, but my achievements were always overshadowed by my cousin's more visible successes. Delilah got into Colorado State, my mother had announced at my graduation party, her voice carrying that familiar, apologetic tone. "She's planning to study botany." "Botany?" Cordelia had repeated, as if I'd announced my intention to study something completely useless. "Well, I suppose someone has to take care of plants." The laughter that followed had burned deeper than they'd probably intended. Here I was, graduating with honors, planning to pursue something I was passionate about, and they made it sound like I was settling for scraps. College had been my escape. For 4 years at Colorado State, I'd been surrounded by people who understood that studying plant biology wasn't a consolation prize. It was a legitimate field that required intelligence, dedication, and skill. I'd thrived in my courses, made genuine friendships, and discovered that there was a whole world of people who valued knowledge and passion over social status and family connections. But every holiday, every family gathering, every phone call home had reminded me that to the Whittemores, I was still the disappointment, the one who'd chosen flowers over finance, who lived modestly instead of lavishly, who preferred quiet authenticity to loud performance. The criticism had intensified after I graduated and took the job at Bloom and Blossom Florist. Never mind that I'd been offered positions at prestigious botanical gardens and research facilities. I'd chosen the flower shop because it combined my love of plants with the joy of helping people celebrate life's most important moments.
To me, creating the perfect bridal bouquet or designing arrangements for someone's anniversary was meaningful work. To my family, it was proof that I lacked ambition. She's working at a little flower shop downtown. I'd overheard my mother telling someone at a charity luncheon. We keep hoping she'll grow out of this phase and do something more substantial. The word substantial had echoed in my head for weeks. What exactly made their work more substantial than mine? Cordelia managed a trust fund she'd inherited. Penelope worked part-time at an art gallery owned by her boyfriend's family. Jasmine had married Trevor straight out of college and spent her days planning social events and shopping. None of them had built anything from scratch. None of them had pursued their passions despite opposition. None of them had chosen their own path over the easier route of family expectations. But it was when I met Nathaniel that their dismissive attitude had truly crystallized into something cruel. I'd been working at the flower shop for about 6 months when he'd walked in on a Thursday afternoon, looking harried and slightly out of place among the delicate arrangements and soft lighting. He'd needed flowers for a business dinner, something elegant but not too romantic, impressive but not ostentatious. I'd spent 20 minutes with him, learning about the event, the venue, the impression he wanted to make. When I'd suggested a sophisticated arrangement of white lilies and green hydrangeas with silver accents, he'd smiled, really smiled, for the first time since walking into the shop. "You're not just arranging flowers," he'd said as I worked. "You're solving a problem. You're helping me communicate something I couldn't figure out how to say." That was Nathaniel in a nutshell. He saw the intelligence and skill in what I did, instead of dismissing it as playing with flowers, like my family always had. When he'd asked me to dinner the following week, it wasn't because he felt sorry for me or because I was convenient. It was because he genuinely enjoyed my company, valued my perspective, and found me interesting. Our courtship had been a revelation. Here was a man who listened when I talked about botany, who asked thoughtful questions about floral design, who treated my work with the same respect he'd give to any other profession. When I'd mentioned that I was considering taking classes in landscape architecture, he immediately offered to help me research programs and figure out the logistics. But when I'd finally introduced him to my family at Penelope's birthday party 2 years ago, the reception was, predictable. "So you're the mysterious boyfriend," Cordelia had said, looking Nathaniel up and down like she was evaluating livestock. "What do you do?" "I'm in real estate development," he'd replied simply. "Oh, how interesting," she'd continued, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "Residential or commercial?" "Both, actually, mostly commercial properties downtown." I'd watched my family exchange those subtle glances that spoke volumes. They'd clearly decided that real estate development was probably code for manages rental properties or something equally unimpressive in their worldview. They'd been polite but distant, asking just enough questions to seem interested while making it clear they weren't particularly impressed. The fact that Nathaniel had been wearing a simple gray suit from Nordstrom instead of something obviously expensive, that he drove a practical BMW instead of a flashy sports car, that he spoke about his work matter-of-factly instead of bragging about his success, all of these things had confirmed their initial assessment that I'd found myself a nice enough man who was probably suitable for someone like me. They'd never bothered to look deeper, to ask more meaningful questions, to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was more to both of us than met the eye. After that party, the comments had started. Little remarks about my boyfriend from work. He'd never worked with me. Speculation about when I'd bring him around more often. He traveled constantly for business. And eventually, after we'd gotten married in our simple courthouse ceremony, the jokes about my mysterious husband who never seemed to be available for family events. "It's like you made him up." Jasmine had said at last year's Christmas gathering, giggling as if she'd made the most clever observation in the world. Are we sure he's real? Maybe Delilah has an imaginary friend situation going on. The laughter that had followed that comment had been the final straw. These people who claimed to love me, who were supposed to be my family, had decided that rather than simply accepting that my husband had work commitments that often kept him busy during holidays, it was more entertaining to suggest I was delusional. But what had hurt the most wasn't the mockery itself. It was the underlying message. They'd looked at me, at my simple life and modest circumstances, and decided that of course I couldn't have attracted someone successful. Of course I couldn't have built a happy marriage with someone accomplished. Of course I was making it all up because, in their worldview, someone like me didn't deserve someone extraordinary. They'd never once considered that maybe Nathaniel avoided family gatherings because he could see exactly how they treated me. They'd never wondered if perhaps he stayed away because he didn't want to subject our peaceful marriage to their constant judgment and criticism. They'd never entertained the possibility that a successful man might actually choose to be with me, not despite my simple lifestyle, but because he valued authenticity over performance. Standing in my kitchen this morning, I realized that yesterday's humiliation at the country club had been just the latest example of a pattern that stretched back decades. Every dismissive comment, every pitying look, every cruel joke had been building to this moment. They'd finally pushed me too far, mocked something too precious to ignore. My phone buzzed with a text from Nathaniel. Running a few minutes behind, but I'll be at the jewelry store by 10:15. Can't wait to finally meet your family properly. I smiled, a real smile that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They thought they knew my story. They thought they'd figured out exactly who I was and what I was capable of achieving. They'd written me off as the family failure, the one who'd never amount to anything significant. In less than 2 hours, they were about to learn just how spectacularly wrong they'd been about everything. At exactly 9:45 a.m., I pulled into the small parking lot behind Prestigious Gems on Rosewood Avenue. My hands were trembling slightly as I turned off the engine, not from nerves exactly, but from the kind of anticipation you feel when you're about to watch justice finally unfold after years of waiting. The morning had warmed up considerably since the early frost, and the Denver sunshine was streaming through the jewelry store's large front windows, making the displays inside sparkle like tiny stars. I'd chosen this particular jewelry store for a reason. Prestigious Gems wasn't any jewelry shop. It was the kind of establishment where Denver's elite bought their engagement rings and anniversary gifts. The owner, Mr. Heinrich Zimmerman, was a 73-year-old master jeweler who'd immigrated from Switzerland 40 years ago and built a reputation for working with only the finest stones and most discerning clients. More importantly, he was one of the few people in Denver who would immediately recognize the craftsmanship and provenance of my wedding ring. 3 years ago, when Nathaniel had commissioned my ring, he had flown to Zurich specifically to work with Mr. Zimmerman's former partner at their original atelier. Each diamond had been hand-selected for its perfect clarity and cut, then set using techniques that had been passed down through generations of Swiss jewelers. The band itself was crafted from a rare platinum alloy that most people would mistake for simple silver. To an untrained eye, it looked modest, even plain. To someone who understood fine jewelry, it was a masterpiece of understated elegance.
They thought they were about to witness my complete breakdown. They had probably spent the entire drive over discussing how to handle my delusion gently, how to stage an intervention, maybe even how to suggest I seek professional help for my apparent inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality. In their minds, this morning would end with me finally admitting that my marriage was a fabrication, my ring was costume jewelry, and my entire adult life had been an elaborate lie I'd been telling myself. I checked my phone one more time. Nathaniel had texted 15 minutes ago. Just finished my call with the Tokyo investors. Parking now. Are you ready for this? More than ready, I'd replied. They have no idea what's coming. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my car and walked around to the front of the store.
The moment I pushed open the heavy glass door, a small bell chimed overhead, and every head in the store turned toward me. The expressions on my family members' faces ranged from smug satisfaction to barely contained glee. They'd positioned themselves strategically throughout the small shop, like they were preparing to witness a public execution. "Delilah, darling," Cordelia called out in that overly sweet voice she used when she was about to enjoy herself at someone else's expense. "We're so glad you decided to go through with this little demonstration. We've been having the most interesting conversation with Mr. Zimmerman here about jewelry authentication." The elderly jeweler looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing the tension in the room but unsure of its source. His thick German accent carried a note of confusion as he addressed me. "Good morning, miss. Your family tells me you have a piece you would like me to examine." "That's right." I pulled off my wedding ring and placed it gently on the black velvet display pad he'd set out on the counter. "I'd like you to tell everyone exactly what this is." Penelope actually giggled, nudging Jasmine with her elbow. "This is going to be so enlightening. I can't wait to see her face when he tells her it's worth about $20. Trevor had positioned himself near the door, probably to prevent me from running away when reality came crashing down. "You know, Delilah, there's no shame in admitting you made a mistake. We all have moments when we embellish things a bit. The important thing is learning from it and moving forward." Mr. Zimmerman picked up my ring with the careful precision of someone who'd handled thousands of precious stones over the decades. He examined it first with his naked eye, turning it slowly under the bright display lights. Then he reached for a jeweler's loupe, the small magnifying glass that would reveal every detail of the ring's construction. The silence in the store was almost oppressive as he studied the ring. My family members had stopped their whispered commentary, watching intently for the moment he'd confirm their assumptions about the cheap fake I'd been wearing for 3 years. But as the seconds ticked by, Mr. Zimmerman's expression began to change. His eyebrows rose slightly, and he made a small sound of surprise that seemed to catch in his throat. He set down the loupe and picked up a more powerful microscope, adjusting the focus carefully as he examined each individual stone. "Mein Gott," he whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "Is there a problem?" Cordelia asked, her voice still confident, but with a slight edge of uncertainty creeping in. Mr. Zimmerman didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the back of his shop and returned with what looked like a thick, leather-bound catalog. He began flipping through pages filled with photographs and detailed descriptions, cross-referencing something about my ring with the information in his book. The silence stretched on, growing more uncomfortable by the moment. I could see my family members exchanging glances, their initial confidence beginning to waver as they realized this wasn't going according to their plan. When you're expecting someone to quickly identify a piece of costume jewelry, a lengthy authentication process isn't exactly reassuring. Finally, Mr. Zimmerman set down his catalog and looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His voice, when he spoke, was carefully controlled, professional. "Miss, may I ask where you acquired this piece?" "It was a gift from my husband," I replied simply. "And your husband's name?" "Nathaniel. Nathaniel Ashford." The change in Mr. Zimmerman's demeanor was instantaneous and dramatic. His eyes widened and he actually took a small step backwards, nearly knocking over the display of gold chains behind him. For a moment, he seemed to be struggling with something, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't find the right words. "Did you say Ashford?" he repeated, his accent making the name sound almost reverent. "That's right." Penelope laughed, but it sounded forced now, nervous. "Oh, come on. What's with all the drama? Just tell us what the ring is worth and let's get this over with." Mr. Zimmerman ignored her completely. Instead, he was staring at me with a look of dawning recognition, as if he was seeing me for the first time. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Ashford? Are you Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford?"
The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode.
I could feel my family's attention sharpen, could sense their growing confusion and alarm as they began to realize that something was very wrong with their carefully orchestrated plan to humiliate me. "Yes," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent store. "I am." That's when Mr. Zimmerman did something that would replay in my mind for years to come. This dignified, elderly Swiss gentleman who'd spent 4 decades serving Denver's most elite clientele, who'd maintained his composure through countless transactions worth millions of dollars, actually bowed. It was a small, respectful bow from the waist, but unmistakably deferential. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice now filled with something approaching awe, "it is my greatest honor to meet you. Your husband spoke of you often during the months we worked together to create your ring." The words hit my family like physical blows. I watched Cordelia's face go pale, saw Penelope's mouth fall open in shock, witnessed Jasmine actually grip Trevor's arm for support. The smug confidence that had filled the store just moments ago evaporated completely, replaced by a stunned silence that spoke louder than any words could have. But Mr. Zimmerman wasn't finished. He picked up my ring again, this time handling it with even more reverence than before. "This," he announced to the room, his voice now carrying the authority of absolute expertise, "is one of the finest pieces I have ever had the privilege to examine. The diamonds are flawless, D-color, internally perfect, each one hand-selected from the Antwerp market. The platinum band is crafted using techniques that only 3 workshops in the world still practice. The setting work was done by my former partner in Zurich, a master craftsman whose pieces are considered works of art." He paused, looking around at the shocked faces of my family members. "This ring," he continued, "represents approximately 18 months of work by some of the finest artisans in Europe. The stones alone are worth more than most people's homes." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the wall behind the counter. My family stood frozen, their faces reflecting various stages of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror as they began to understand what they'd walked into. And that's when I heard the familiar sound of the store's door chime, followed by a voice I knew better than my own. "Sorry I'm late, darling. Traffic was murder getting across town." I turned to see Nathaniel walking through the door, and for a moment, I felt the same flutter of happiness I'd experienced every time I'd seen him for the past 3 years. He was wearing one of his perfectly tailored charcoal suits, the kind that looked deceptively simple until you noticed the hand-stitched details and perfect fit that marked it as custom-made. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from running his hands through it during his phone calls, and his smile was warm and genuine as his eyes found mine across the crowded store. But it was what happened next that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Mr. Zimmerman, this reserved, dignified man who'd maintained his composure through decades of dealing with wealthy clientele, actually gasped audibly when he saw my husband. Then, in a voice filled with unmistakable recognition and respect, he spoke the words that would shatter my family's world completely. "Mr. Ashford, what an unexpected pleasure to see you again, sir." The moment Nathaniel stepped fully into the store, the atmosphere shifted so dramatically, it felt like the air pressure had changed. My family, who had been frozen in shocked silence just seconds ago, suddenly came alive with frantic energy, but not the kind they had expected to display this morning. Instead of smugly watching me crumble under the weight of exposed lies, they were scrambling to process information that didn't fit any of their assumptions about my life. "Nathaniel," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos of emotions swirling through me, "I'd like you to meet my family." "Family? This is my husband, Nathaniel Ashford." The introductions that followed were unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. These were people who prided themselves on their social graces, their ability to navigate any situation with polished confidence. I'd watched them charm business partners, schmooze with politicians, and work rooms full of Denver's elite without breaking a sweat. But standing there in prestigious gems, faced with the man they'd spent 3 years insisting didn't exist, they were completely out of their depth.
Cordelia was the first to recover, extending a perfectly manicured hand toward Nathaniel with a smile that looked like it had been painted on with considerable effort. "Mr. Ashford, what a surprise to finally meet you. I'm Delilah's aunt, Cordelia Whitmore." Nathaniel shook her hand with the same professional courtesy he showed to business associates. Polite, but not particularly warm. "Mrs. Whitmore, Delilah has told me so much about her family." There was something in the way he said it, perfectly cordial on the surface, but with just enough subtle emphasis to suggest that what I'd told him wasn't entirely flattering. I watched Cordelia's smile falter slightly as she tried to decode his meaning. Penelope stepped forward next, and I could practically see her mind racing as she tried to reconcile this well-dressed, clearly successful man with her narrative about my fictional husband. "I'm Penelope, Delilah's cousin. We've been so curious about you. Delilah has been so secretive about your relationship." "Have I?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "I've always been happy to talk about Nathaniel. You just never seemed particularly interested in listening."
The comment hung in the air, and I watched my family exchange those subtle glances that had once made me feel excluded, but now just looked desperate. They were trying to communicate with each other, to figure out how to handle this situation that had spun so completely out of their control. Jasmine, never one to be left out of a conversation, jumped in with the kind of probing question that would have once made me squirm with embarrassment. "So, what is it that you do exactly, Nathaniel? Delilah mentioned real estate, but that covers such a broad range of work." It was a loaded question, the kind designed to expose someone who'd been exaggerating their importance or success. I'd seen her use the same technique at dinner parties, asking follow-up questions that would reveal when someone's job title was more impressive than their actual responsibilities. Nathaniel's answer was characteristically straightforward. "I develop commercial properties primarily, though I have some residential projects as well. Most of my work focuses on downtown Denver and the surrounding metropolitan area." "How interesting," Trevor chimed in, and I could tell he was trying to take control of the conversation. "What kind of commercial properties? Office buildings? Retail spaces?" "Both, actually. Mixed-use developments are becoming increasingly popular. My company just finished a 40-story complex on 17th Street that combines office space, luxury condominiums, and street-level retail." I watched the blood drain from Trevor's face. The Ashford Tower on 17th Street wasn't just any building. It was one of the most prominent additions to Denver's skyline in the past 5 years, a gleaming glass monument that had been featured on the cover of Denver Business Journal and had won multiple architectural awards. If Nathaniel was claiming credit for that project? "The Ashford Tower?" Penelope asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's right. We broke ground about 3 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. The Ashford Tower wasn't just expensive real estate, it was a landmark, the kind of project that required hundreds of millions in investment, teams of architects and contractors, and the sort of political connections that took decades to build. If my quiet, modest husband was responsible for that building, then everything they thought they knew about our financial situation was not just wrong, it was spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. But it was Mr. Zimmerman who delivered the next revelation, his voice filled with the kind of reverence usually reserved for discussing great works of art. "Mr. Ashford, if I may," the elderly jeweler interjected, "I was just explaining to your wife's family about the remarkable ring you commissioned. Perhaps you could tell them about the process. I think they would find it educational." Nathaniel glanced at me, and I could see the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He understood exactly what was happening here, and while he was too much of a gentleman to enjoy someone else's humiliation, he wasn't about to let my family continue their pattern of dismissing me. "Of course," he said, moving to stand beside me at the counter. "When I decided to propose to Delilah, I wanted to create something that would be as unique and extraordinary as she is. I'd heard about Mr. Zimmerman's former partner in Zurich through some business associates who collect fine jewelry. I spent
2 weeks in Switzerland working with the master craftsman to select each stone individually. We examined hundreds of diamonds before choosing the 12 that made the final cut. Each one had to meet very specific criteria, not just for clarity and color, but for how they would work together as a complete piece. Cordelia had gone very pale. 2 weeks in Switzerland, she repeated faintly. The setting work alone took 8 months, Nathaniel continued. The platinum had to be specially alloyed to achieve the exact color and durability we wanted. There are only 3 workshops in the world that still do this type of hand forging, and we had to wait for an opening in their schedule. Jasmine was gripping Trevor's arm so tightly her knuckles had gone white. 8 months, she whispered. The final assembly was done in Zurich as well. Mr. Zimmerman's partner insisted on overseeing every detail personally. When it was finished, he told me it was one of the finest pieces his workshop had ever produced. Mr. Zimmerman nodded enthusiastically. Hans called me specifically to tell me about this ring. He said it was a masterwork, something that would be passed down through generations as a family heirloom. What? Penelope's voice cracked slightly, and she had to clear her throat before continuing. What does something like that cost? The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment of truth, the point where all their assumptions about my modest lifestyle and my husband's adequate income were either going to be confirmed or shattered completely. Nathaniel looked at me before answering, and I could see him weighing his words carefully. He'd never been one to flaunt his wealth, never felt the need to impress people with dollar figures or boast about expensive purchases, but he also understood that my family had spent 3 years mocking something precious to both of us. And sometimes people need to face the full weight of their mistakes. The materials alone were just over $2 million, he said quietly. The craftsmanship and design work brought the total to approximately $3.5 million.
The silence that followed was so complete it felt supernatural. Even the street noise from outside seemed to have vanished, leaving us suspended in a bubble of shocked disbelief. My family stood frozen like statues, their faces reflecting various stages of mental recalibration as they tried to process what they'd just heard. $3.5 million for the cheap fake ring they'd been mocking for 3 years, for the costume jewelry they'd used as evidence of my delusions and failures, for the symbol of a marriage they'd insisted was imaginary. But the real revelation wasn't the dollar amount. It was what that amount represented. Someone who spends $3.5 million on an engagement ring isn't just wealthy. They're operating in a completely different financial stratosphere, one where such purchases are meaningful but not financially devastating. They're the kind of wealthy that doesn't need to announce itself, that doesn't require validation or recognition from others. They're the kind of wealthy that my family, for all their inherited money and social pretensions, could only dream of becoming. Trevor was the first to break the silence, his voice hoarse with shock. $3.5 million. Give or take, Nathaniel replied casually, as if he were discussing the price of dinner. The exchange rate fluctuated quite a bit during the time we were working on it. I watched my family's faces as the full implications began to sink in. If Nathaniel could spend that much money on a ring, casually, without apparent financial strain, then what did that say about his overall wealth? What did that say about the business empire they'd dismissed as some real estate work? What did that say about the woman they'd been treating like the family failure for the past 3 decades? And perhaps, most importantly, what did that say about their own judgment, their own intelligence, their own ability to recognize success when it was standing right in front of them? The answers to those questions were written clearly on their faces, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't the one in the room who looked foolish. The aftermath of Nathaniel's revelation hit my family like a series of seismic aftershocks. I could practically see their minds working overtime, trying to reconcile 3 years of assumptions with the devastating reality now standing before them in a perfectly tailored suit. The comfortable superiority they'd worn like designer clothing for decades was disintegrating in real time, and watching it happen was both satisfying and oddly sad.
Cordelia was the first to attempt damage control, her social training kicking in as she tried to salvage what remained of the family's dignity. "Well," she said, her voice pitched higher than usual, "this is certainly unexpected. Nathaniel, I hope you understand that we simply didn't know much about you. Delilah has always been so private about her personal life." It was a masterful deflection, the kind my family excelled at, taking a situation where they were clearly in the wrong and somehow making it about someone else's failure to communicate properly. I'd watched them employ this tactic countless times over the years, turning their own shortcomings into other people's problems. But Nathaniel wasn't the kind of man who could be easily maneuvered. His response was polite, but pointed, delivered with the same calm confidence he used in boardrooms when someone tried to negotiate from a position of weakness. "Actually, Mrs. Whittemore, Delilah has always been quite open about our marriage. She's invited me to several family gatherings over the years. I chose not to attend most of them because my travel schedule is demanding, but also because I could tell from her descriptions that family events weren't always comfortable for her." The implication hung in the air like an accusation. Not only had they spent 3 years mocking a marriage that was not only real but extraordinarily successful, but their treatment of me had been so obviously cruel that my husband had deliberately avoided them to protect both of us from their toxicity. Jasmine jumped in, desperation making her voice sharp. "But surely you can understand our confusion. I mean, Delilah lives in that tiny apartment, works like flower shop. It doesn't exactly scream married to a billionaire." The word billionaire slipped out before she could stop it, and I watched her face flush red as she realized what she had revealed. They'd been doing research, probably frantically Googling Nathaniel's name on their phones while he'd been explaining about the ring. They'd found out exactly who they were dealing with, and it was even worse than they had initially feared. Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he was beginning to lose patience with the conversation. "Actually, Delilah lives in that apartment because she chooses to. She works at the flower shop because she loves what she does. I've offered countless times to help her expand the business, to buy her own shop, to do whatever would make her happier. But she's always been more interested in building something meaningful than in impressing people." The subtle criticism in his words was devastating. Here was a man worth billions who valued substance over show, who supported his wife's modest choices because he understood that happiness didn't come from external validation. Meanwhile, they'd spent years treating me like a failure because I didn't measure success the way they did. Penelope tried a different approach, her voice taking on the wheedling tone she'd used since childhood when she wanted something. "We just wish we'd had more opportunities to get to know you. Family is so important to us, and we'd love to include you more in our traditions and gatherings." It was laughable, really. These people who had spent 3 years suggesting I was delusional were now trying to claim they'd always wanted to welcome my husband into the family. The transparent attempt at social climbing was so obvious it was almost embarrassing to witness. "That's very kind," Nathaniel replied, his tone suggesting it was anything but kind. Though I have to say, after hearing about this morning's experiment, I'm not sure family gatherings are the best environment for building relationships. Mr. Zimmerman, who had been quietly observing the family drama unfold in his store, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should finish cleaning Mrs. Ashford's ring while you all continue your reunion." He was trying to give us a graceful exit from what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable situation, but I wasn't ready to leave yet. For 3 decades, I'd been walking away from confrontations, avoiding conflict, taking the path of least resistance to keep the peace. But standing there next to my husband, watching my family scramble to rewrite history in real time, I realized I had something to say. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the store, "I think this is exactly the right place for this conversation. You see, you all came here this morning expecting to watch me be humiliated. You brought cameras on your phones, didn't you? I saw Jasmine recording when we first started talking to Mr. Zimmerman." Jasmine's face went scarlet. I was just You were planning to document my breakdown for posterity. Maybe share it at the next family gathering as a funny story about poor, delusional Delilah finally facing reality. I looked around at each of their faces, seeing my words hit their targets with pinpoint accuracy. But now you're discovering that the reality is very different from what you expected. Nathaniel moved closer to me, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. Delilah, you don't owe them any explanations. No, I don't, I agreed. But I want to give them some anyway, because I think it's important they understand exactly what they've been doing for the past 3 years. I turned to face my family fully, feeling more confident and powerful than I had in any interaction with them since childhood. You've spent our entire lives treating me like I wasn't quite good enough, wasn't quite smart enough, wasn't quite successful enough to deserve your respect. When I chose botany over business, you mocked it. When I took a job I loved instead of one that impressed you, you called it settling. When I married a man who made me happy, you decided he must not exist because someone like me couldn't possibly deserve someone extraordinary. The silence in the store was absolute. Even Mr. Zimmerman had stopped his work to listen, his elderly eyes moving between me and my family like he was watching a particularly compelling drama unfold. But here's what you never understood. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. Success isn't about impressing other people. Love isn't about meeting someone else's standards. And worth isn't measured by how much attention you command at family gatherings. Cordelia tried to interrupt, her voice shaky. Delilah, we never meant to— Yes, you did, I said firmly. You absolutely meant to. Every cruel joke, every dismissive comment, every time you suggested I was living in a fantasy world, you meant all of it. You enjoyed it. It made you feel superior to have someone to look down on, someone whose failures made your successes seem more impressive. Trevor, who had been unnaturally quiet since learning about the Ashford Tower, finally found his voice. Look, maybe we made some mistakes, but you have to admit you weren't exactly forthcoming about your situation. My situation? I repeated, genuinely incredulous. My marriage? My life? The fact that I was happy? I shook my head. I was never secretive about anything important. I told you I was married. I told you my husband traveled for work. I told you I was content with my life. You just decided that none of it could possibly be true because it didn't fit your narrative about who I was supposed to be. Nathaniel's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture of solidarity that felt like a lifeline. What Delilah is too kind to say is that your treatment of her has been unconscionable. I've watched her struggle with family gatherings for 3 years, seen her come home upset after every interaction, watched her question her own worth because the people who are supposed to love her unconditionally have spent decades making her feel inadequate. His words hit the room like a physical blow. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding or a failure to communicate. This was about a pattern of emotional abuse that had been going on for so long that it had become normalized, so subtle that they probably didn't even recognize it as cruelty. And now, I said, looking around at their stricken faces, you want to pretend it never happened. You want to welcome us into the family with open arms, invite us to more gatherings, act like you've always been supportive and loving. But the damage is done. You can't unsay 3 years of cruel jokes about my imaginary husband. You can't undo decades of treating me like the family disappointment.
The weight of truth was settling over the jewelry store like fog. My family stood there, faced with the undeniable evidence of their own behavior, their own cruelty, their own spectacular failure of judgment. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who felt ashamed. I was the one who held all the power. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, thick with the weight of years of accumulated hurt finally being acknowledged. My family stood frozen, each of them processing not just the financial revelation about Nathaniel, but the devastating accuracy of my assessment of their behavior. For the first time in my life, they couldn't argue with me, couldn't dismiss my feelings, couldn't turn the conversation back to my supposed shortcomings. But I could see the gears turning behind their eyes. These were people who had spent decades navigating social situations, manipulating conversations to their advantage, and finding ways to come out on top regardless of the circumstances. They weren't going to go down without a fight. It was Cordelia who made the first move, her voice taking on the trembling quality she'd perfected for maximum emotional impact. "Delilah, sweetheart, I can see you're upset and perhaps we've all made some mistakes here. But family is family and we love you. Surely we can work through this together." The word love coming from her lips after everything that had just been said was almost obscene. It was the kind of manipulation she'd used my entire life, offering conditional affection as a tool to control situations and avoid accountability. But before I could respond, Nathaniel stepped forward, and I realized that while I'd been preparing emotionally for this confrontation, he'd been preparing strategically. The man who'd built a billion-dollar empire didn't get there by accident, and he certainly didn't get there by allowing people to manipulate him or the people he cared about. "Actually, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that filled boardrooms and commanded immediate attention, "I think it might be helpful if we addressed this situation properly. Professionally, you might say." There was something in his tone that made everyone in the room straighten slightly. This wasn't social conversation anymore. This was business. "You see," Nathaniel continued, pulling out his phone with deliberate casualness, "I've been documenting quite a bit of what's happened here this morning. Voice recordings, to be precise. My phone has been recording since I walked into the store." The color drained from every face in the room simultaneously. They'd been so focused on their own shock and scrambling attempts at damage control that none of them had noticed him quietly activating his recording app. "Now, I'm not typically one to make threats," he went on, his tone remaining conversational, despite the obvious menace beneath the words. "But I think it's important that everyone understands the current situation clearly." He walked over to stand beside me, creating a united front that was impossible to ignore. "What we have here is a documented pattern of psychological abuse, spanning several decades, culminating in a deliberate attempt to publicly humiliate my wife this morning. We have witness testimony from Mr. Zimmerman, who heard your entire conversation before I arrived. And we have your own admission that you came here to expecting to prove Delilah was delusional." Jasmine started to protest, her voice high and panicked. "It wasn't abuse. We were just concerned family members," Nathaniel finished smoothly. "Is that what you call it when you spend 3 years telling someone their marriage is imaginary? When you mock their wedding ring as fake jewelry? When you stage an intervention to force them to admit they're mentally unstable?" Each question hit like a physical blow. Trevor was looking increasingly pale, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning in the store. "Furthermore," Nathaniel continued, "you should all be aware that my legal team is quite experienced in handling harassment cases. We've dealt with business competitors, disgruntled former partners, and, unfortunately, even family members who've tried to exploit or manipulate people close to me." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. He wasn't just talking about hurt feelings or family drama. He was talking about legal consequences, about the kind of public exposure that could destroy their carefully cultivated social standing. Penelope found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Nathaniel, surely we can resolve this privately, as a family." "Family," he repeated thoughtfully, as if testing the word. "Because, from what I have observed, families are supposed to support each other, celebrate each other's successes, and protect each other from harm. But what I've seen here today suggests that your definition of family is quite different." He pulled up something on his phone, scrolling through what looked like notes or perhaps a contact list. "You know, I've been thinking about this morning's events, and I realized something interesting. Your behavior towards Delilah could actually have significant financial implications.
The room got dead quiet, except for the sound of Mr. Zimmerman continuing his work at the counter, polishing my ring with careful strokes while pretending not to listen to the drama unfolding around him.
You see, Nathaniel explained, defamation of character can be quite costly, especially when it affects someone's reputation in their professional community. Delilah is well respected in the floral design industry here in Denver. Her work has been featured in several high-profile weddings and events. The suggestion that she's mentally unstable, that she fabricates relationships, that she lies about significant aspects of her life, well, that could seriously damage her ability to work with clients who need to trust her judgment and reliability. Cordelia's face had gone ash gray. We never said anything publicly. Didn't you? Nathaniel interrupted, his tone mild but his words cutting. Because I count at least 6 other customers who were in this store when you made your comments about Delilah's delusions and her need for professional help. Mr. Zimmerman, would you say this conversation has been audible to your other patrons? The elderly jeweler looked up from his work, clearly uncomfortable but unable to lie. Yes, sir. The store has excellent acoustics. So, we have multiple witnesses to public defamation. We have evidence of a coordinated effort to humiliate someone in a public setting. We have admission of intent to record the incident for later sharing. And we have a documented pattern of psychological manipulation spanning multiple years. He looked around at each of their faces, letting the implications sink in completely before delivering his next line. The question now is how we're going to handle this situation going forward. Trevor, desperate to regain some control, tried to interject with what probably sounded reasonable in his head. Look, we get it. We made some mistakes, but we're family, and families work things out. There's no need to make this into some kind of legal battle. Nathaniel's smile was sharp as a blade. You're absolutely right that there's no need for a legal battle, but that depends entirely on whether this family is willing to acknowledge what they've done and make appropriate amends. What kind of amends? Cordelia asked carefully, though her voice suggested she was afraid to hear the answer. Well, for starters, public apologies. Formal, written statements acknowledging your behavior and its impact on Delilah, distributed to everyone who has heard your comments about her over the past 3 years. Penelope looked like she might be sick. Public apologies? But that would be embarrassing. Yes, I said quietly, speaking for the first time in several minutes. It would be embarrassing. Almost as embarrassing as spending 3 years being treated like the family joke, having your marriage mocked at every gathering, and being told you need psychiatric help because no one believed you could be loved by someone successful. The parallel was perfect, and everyone in the room understood it immediately. They were afraid of a little embarrassment over their own actions, but they'd subjected me to years of public humiliation without a second thought. There would also need to be some financial considerations, Nathaniel added. Delilah has expressed interest in expanding her floral business for some time. I think a family investment in her professional growth would be an appropriate gesture of support. How much? Trevor asked bluntly, clearly trying to calculate whether buying their way out of this situation would be cheaper than fighting it. Substantial enough to demonstrate genuine remorse, Nathaniel replied smoothly. Not enough to bankrupt anyone, but significant enough to ensure that future interactions with Delilah are based on respect rather than condescension. I watched my family exchange glances, weighing their options. They could fight this, but they'd already seen how thoroughly outmatched they were. Nathaniel had resources they couldn't compete with, evidence they couldn't deny, and the moral high ground they'd forfeited years ago. Or they could submit to his terms, acknowledge their failures publicly, and attempt to rebuild whatever remained of their relationship with me. The choice was entirely theirs, and for the first time in decades, I held all the cards. The tension in prestigious gems had reached a breaking point. My family stood there like defendants awaiting a verdict, their faces reflecting various stages of panic, calculation, and desperate strategizing. The comfortable world where they'd always held the power, where their judgment was final and their opinions mattered most, had completely collapsed around them in the span of 30 minutes. Cordelia was the first to crack under the pressure. Her perfectly composed facade finally shattered, revealing the desperation underneath. "This is ridiculous," she burst out, her voice shrill with barely controlled hysteria.
You can't seriously be threatening to sue us for family disagreements. We're not criminals, Nathaniel. We're Delilah's family. Family, I repeated, my voice cutting through her protestations like ice. You keep using that word, but I don't think you understand what it means. I stepped forward, feeling a strength I'd never experienced before. Every year of swallowed insults, every holiday spent feeling inadequate, every cruel joke I'd endured was fuel for the fire burning inside me now. A family doesn't spend 30 years making one of their own feel worthless. A family doesn't orchestrate public humiliation for entertainment. A family doesn't mock someone's marriage, their career choices, their entire life because it doesn't meet their arbitrary standards of success. Jasmine tried to interrupt, tears forming in her eyes. Delilah, we never meant to hurt you. We were just...
Just what? I snapped, whirling to face her. Just having fun? Just being honest? Just trying to help me face reality? I could hear my voice echoing off the jewelry store's walls, could see other customers stopping their browsing to stare at our confrontation. Because let me tell you what reality looks like from my perspective. I gestured toward Nathaniel, who stood beside me like an immovable pillar of support. Reality is that I married a man who sees my worth, who values my intelligence, who respects my choices even when they're different from what he might choose. Reality is that I built a life based on love and mutual respect rather than competition and social climbing. Penelope was openly crying now, her perfectly applied makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. We're sorry, okay? We're sorry. What more do you want from us? I want you to understand, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. I want you to truly comprehend what you've done. For 3 years, you told me my marriage was fake. You mocked my wedding ring as costume jewelry. You suggested I needed psychiatric help because I refused to admit I was living a fantasy. I looked around at each of their faces, seeing my words hit home with devastating accuracy. But the fantasy wasn't mine, it was yours. You fantasized that I was the family failure because it made you feel better about your own lives. You fantasized that my quiet happiness was actually desperation and delusion because you couldn't stand the idea that someone who lived so differently from you could be genuinely content. Mr. Zimmerman chose that moment to clear his throat softly, holding up my ring. The diamonds caught the light, sending tiny rainbows across the store's walls. Your ring is ready, Mrs. Ashford, he said with quiet dignity. It's truly a magnificent piece. Your husband has exquisite taste. The simple statement landed like a bomb in the charged atmosphere. Here was an independent expert, someone with no stake in our family drama, confirming everything that had been revealed. The ring was real. The marriage was real. I was exactly who I'd always claimed to be. Trevor, who had been calculating frantically on his phone, looked up with something approaching panic in his eyes. The Ashford Group, he said hollowly. I've been researching. Jesus Christ, Delilah, your husband is worth $3 billion. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. $3 billion, not millions. Billions. The kind of wealth that bought skyscrapers, that shaped city skylines, that put someone in the same financial category as tech moguls and oil barons. Cordelia actually staggered backward, grabbing onto a display case for support. $3 billion? She repeated faintly. Give or take, Nathaniel said with the same casual tone he'd used about the ring's price. The exact figure fluctuates with market conditions, but that's the general range. I watched my family process this information, watched them realize that they hadn't just misjudged my marriage or my husband's success, they had dismissed someone who could buy and sell their entire social circle without noticing the expense, someone whose annual charitable donations probably exceeded their combined net worth. We need to fix this, Jasmine whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. We need to make this right. Do you? I asked quietly.
Or do you just need to avoid the consequences of your actions? The question struck home because it cut to the heart of their motivation. Were they finally recognizing the pain they'd caused me, or were they simply terrified of the social and financial ramifications of having alienated someone so powerful? Penelope dropped to her knees right there on the jewelry store's marble floor, her designer dress pooling around her as she looked up at me with tear-streaked desperation. Delilah, please, I'm begging you. We were wrong. We were so wrong about everything. Please don't destroy us over this. The sight of my cousin, who had spent years looking down on me with condescending pity, now literally begging for mercy, should have felt triumphant. Instead, it just felt sad. These people who had seemed so powerful, so sure of themselves, so superior, were revealed as small, frightened, and ultimately pathetic. Destroy you? I repeated. Is that what you think this is about? Revenge? I looked around at each of their faces, seeing my words hit home with devastating accuracy. But the fantasy wasn't mine, it was yours. You fantasized that I was the family failure because it made you feel better about your own lives. You fantasized that my quiet happiness was actually desperation and delusion because you couldn't stand the idea that someone who lived so differently from you could be genuinely content. Nathaniel moved closer to me, his hand finding mine. But they had their chance for that, he said quietly. Years of chances. And instead of taking any of them, they used you as entertainment, as a cautionary tale, as proof of their own superiority. His words were like a final judgment, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had seen enough to make an informed decision.
So now, he continued, they have different choices to make. They can accept responsibility for their actions, make genuine amends, and hope to rebuild some kind of relationship with Delilah based on actual respect. Or they can face the legal and social consequences of their behavior. Cordelia straightened slowly, some semblance of her old composure returning. What exactly are you proposing? The terms I outlined before, Nathaniel replied. Public apologies, financial investment in Delilah's business, and a complete change in how this family treats her going forward. Non-negotiable terms, with legal agreements to ensure compliance. And if we refuse, Trevor asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. Nathaniel's smile was cold as winter. Then my legal team will file defamation suits against each of you individually. We'll seek damages for emotional distress, professional harm, and intentional infliction of mental anguish. The cases will be public record, which means the entire Denver social scene will know exactly why one of the city's wealthiest men is suing his wife's family. He paused, letting that sink in completely. Given the evidence we have, recordings, witnesses, documented patterns of behavior, I'm quite confident we would win, and given my resources versus yours, I'm equally confident that fighting us would be financially ruinous for all of you. The silence that followed was profound. My family had run out of options, out of clever manipulations, out of ways to control the narrative. They were faced with a simple choice: accountability or destruction. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had to choose between dignity and family acceptance. They were. The decision, when it came, arrived not with dramatic declarations or heated arguments, but with the quiet desperation of people who finally understood they had no cards left to play. Cordelia was the one who broke first, her voice barely above a whisper as she looked directly at me for what felt like the first time in years. "We accept your terms," she said, her usual commanding presence reduced to something fragile and defeated. "We accept them all." The words hung in the air of the jewelry store like the end of a long, bitter war. Jasmine was still crying quietly, her sobs the only sound breaking the profound silence that followed her mother's surrender. Penelope remained on her knees on the marble floor, looking like a broken doll in her expensive designer dress. But it was Trevor who surprised me most.
He straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Nathaniel, then at me, with something that might have been genuine remorse in his eyes. I want to say something, not because I have to, not because it's part of any legal agreement, but because it needs to be said. He cleared his throat, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily to him. Delilah, I've been thinking about everything you said, and you're right. We didn't just make mistakes or have misunderstandings. We were cruel, deliberately cruel, and we enjoyed it because it made us feel superior. His admission was so unexpected, so raw, that even Nathaniel looked surprised. This wasn't the calculated damage control I'd expected from Trevor. This sounded like actual recognition of the harm they had caused. I don't know why we needed you to be the family failure. Maybe because it was easier than examining our own lives, our own choices. Maybe because having someone to look down on made us feel more successful by comparison. But that's no excuse for what we put you through. Jasmine lifted her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. We turned you into a joke. Your marriage, your life, your choices, we made it all into entertainment for ourselves. And the worst part is, we convinced ourselves we were being loving family members who were just concerned about you. Penelope struggled to her feet, her legs shaking as she stood. I recorded this morning, she said quietly, pulling out her phone. I was going to share it with everyone, show them video of you finally admitting your marriage was fake. I was going to make it into a funny story we'd tell for years. She looked at the phone in her hand like it was something poisonous. I deleted it the moment Mr. Zimmerman called you Mrs. Ashford. But the fact that I was planning to do that, the fact that I thought your pain would be funny, she shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. The acknowledgments were more than I'd ever expected from them. For 30 years, I dreamed of moments like this, times when they would finally see what they'd been doing to me, when they would recognize my worth and treat me with the respect I deserved. But now that it was happening, I found myself feeling something unexpected. Sadness for all the years we'd lost to their cruelty and my silence. Nathaniel squeezed my hand gently, a silent reminder that I didn't owe them forgiveness just because they'd finally admitted their wrongs. The choice of how to respond was entirely mine. The apologies will be written and delivered within 1 week, I said finally, my voice steady and businesslike. To every family member, every family friend, everyone who's heard your comments about my marriage over the past 3 years. They will be specific about what you did wrong and why it was harmful.
Cordelia nodded quickly. Yes, of course. The financial investment in my business expansion will be substantial enough to demonstrate genuine commitment to making amends, I continued. Nathaniel's attorney will draft the agreements, and you'll have no input into how the money is used. It's a gesture of support, not a business partnership. We understand, Trevor said quietly. And going forward, I said, looking around at each of their faces, any future relationship between us will be based on mutual respect. That means no more dismissive comments about my choices, no more jokes about my lifestyle, no more treating me like I'm less than you because I live differently. It also means, Nathaniel added, his voice carrying unmistakable authority, that any backsliding, any return to old patterns, any attempt to manipulate or demean Delilah in the future will result in immediate legal action. This is a one-time offer of redemption. There won't be a second chance. My family nodded in unison, looking like chastened children receiving a final warning from a strict but fair principal. Mr. Zimmerman, who had been quietly observing the entire drama while continuing to polish jewelry at his counter, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Ashford," he said with gentle dignity, "your ring is ready." He held it out to me on the velvet pad, the diamonds catching the afternoon light streaming through the store's windows. I slipped it back onto my finger, feeling the familiar weight of it settle into place, but something had changed about how it felt. For 3 years, I'd worn this ring as a symbol of my private happiness, something precious that I protected from my family's mockery. Now, it felt like armor, like a declaration of my worth that no one could ever question again. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman," I said warmly, "for everything."
The elderly jeweler smiled, his eyes twinkling with what looked like approval. "It has been my honor, Mrs. Ashford. Please give my regards to your husband's partner in Zurich. Tell him Heinrich says the ring has served its purpose beautifully." As we prepared to leave, Cordelia made one last attempt at connection. "Cordelia, I hope someday you might be willing to have dinner with us, as a real family this time." I looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the predictable matriarch who had intimidated me my entire life, but a woman who had spent so many years being cruel that she'd forgotten how to be kind. There was genuine regret in her eyes, but also fear. Fear of losing the social status and family connections that had defined her identity for decades. "Maybe someday," I said finally, "when you've learned how to see me as an equal instead of a project to fix or a problem to manage." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "We'll do better," she whispered. "We have to do better." As Nathaniel and I walked out of prestigious Gems and into the bright Denver sunshine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the deep, lasting peace that comes from finally standing up for yourself and winning. "How do you feel?" Nathaniel asked as we reached our cars. I considered the question seriously. How did I feel? Triumphant? Vindicated? Satisfied? All of those emotions were there, but underneath them was something simpler and more profound. "Free," I said finally. "I feel free." He smiled, the kind of smile that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. "Good. You deserve to feel free. You always have." As I drove home through the familiar streets of Denver, I thought about the little girl who had painted sunflowers in the corner of her grandmother's living room while adults discussed her artistic pursuits with condescending amusement. I thought about the teenager who had chosen botany over business and been made to feel like she was settling for less. I thought about the young woman who had found love with someone extraordinary and been told she was living in a fantasy. That girl, that teenager, that young woman, they had all been waiting for this moment, waiting for the day when their worth would be recognized, when their choices would be validated, when their quiet strength would finally be seen for what it truly was. And now, driving home to my modest apartment, where my billionaire husband would be waiting with dinner and genuine interest in my day, I realized that the validation I'd been seeking had always been there. I'd just been looking for it in the wrong places. The family that had spent decades making me feel worthless had finally learned what I was truly worth. But more importantly, I had learned it too. And that knowledge was worth more than all the diamonds in Switzerland. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.